The wind had a way of finding every crack in the old pine boards, whistling through Eleanor Bishop's modest home like a mournful spirit that refused to leave. She sat by the window, her needle moving in steady rhythm through worn fabric, mending what could be mended, patching what could still hold together. Outside, the early winter of 1882 was settling over Dust Valley, Wyoming, painting the world in shades of gray and brown. Eleanor didn't look up when the wind rattled the shutters. She'd grown accustomed to its complaints, just as she'd grown accustomed to the silence that filled the spaces between its howling. At 29, she wore her solitude like a second skin, neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, simply necessary. The dress she was mending belonged to Mrs. Hartley, the banker's wife. Eleanor's fingers, once soft from a life of modest comfort, now bore the calluses of countless hours spent with needle and thread. She'd become the town's seamstress not by choice, but by circumstance, taking up the trade after Thomas died in the coal mine collapse 2 years prior. 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days, to be precise. She kept count, though she couldn't say why. A knock at the door broke her concentration. Eleanor glanced at the mantel clock, 3:30. Too early for customers picking up their orders. Too late for new commissions. She set aside her work carefully, smoothing her plain gray dress as she rose. Judge Morrison stood on her doorstep, his thick mustache frosted with ice crystals. Behind him, the town stretched out in its familiar pattern, the main street with its false-fronted buildings, the church steeple pointing accusingly at the heavy sky, and beyond that, the endless prairie that swallowed men whole and spit out their bones. "Mrs. Bishop." The judge tipped his hat. "Might I come in official business? I'm afraid." Eleanor stepped aside wordlessly. She knew what official business meant these days. The judge settled his considerable bulk into Thomas's old chair. She still thought of it as Thomas's chair and pulled out a folded document from his coat. "I'll speak plainly, ma'am. The territorial tax on your property is coming due, $300 by spring, or the land reverts to the bank for auction." The number hung in the air between them like a physical thing. $300. It might as well have been 3,000. Eleanor's hands, so steady with the needle, trembled slightly as she clasped them in her lap. "I see," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now, Harvey Lamont at the bank has expressed interest in purchasing the property directly. He's prepared to offer you $100, cash money. If you sign over the deed before the tax comes due, it would save you the unpleasantness of eviction proceedings." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "This land was my husband's. He worked 16 years to buy it free and clear." "I understand that, ma'am, but sentiment doesn't pay taxes." The judge's voice softened slightly. $100 would see you through the winter. Maybe set you up in a room at Mrs. Dolly's boarding house. "No." The word came out harder than she intended. "I'll find the money." Judge Morrison sighed, his breath visible in the cold room. Eleanor realized she'd let the fire die down again, too lost in her work to notice the creeping chill. "Very well. You have until the 1st of April. Good day, Mrs. Bishop." After he left, Eleanor stood in the center of her small parlor, looking at the space that had once held such promise. Thomas had built this house with his own hands, laid every board, driven every nail. He'd carried her across the threshold the day they married, both of them laughing at the tradition, both of them believing in forever. The sewing money barely kept her fed and the house marginally warm. $300 in 5 months was impossible. She knew it. Judge Morrison knew it. Harvey Lamont certainly knew it. He'd been eyeing this property ever since the rumors started about the railroad coming through. Eleanor walked to the kitchen, her footsteps echoing on the pine floors. From the back window, she could see the small stable where Thomas had kept his horse, now standing empty. And beyond that, the rise of land that marked the beginning of the vast Longhorn Hill Ranch. Smoke rose from the ranch's chimneys, a sign of life and warmth that seemed to mock her own cold hearth. She'd sold everything of value after Thomas died: his horse, his father's pocket watch, even her mother's silver brush set, the one luxury she'd brought west as a bride. All that remained was the land itself, these 20 acres of prairie grass and possibility that Thomas had loved more than life itself. "It's good soil, Ellie," he used to say, running it through his fingers like gold dust. "We'll build something here, something that lasts." Eleanor pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window. She wouldn't cry. She'd used up all her tears in those first brutal months after the mine collapse, when well-meaning neighbors brought casseroles and empty condolences, when the other miners' wives wept openly at the memorial service while Eleanor sat dry-eyed and hollow, unable to produce the grief they expected of her. She'd learned that tears changed nothing. They didn't bring men back from the dark. They didn't pay bills or mend clothes or keep the wind from whistling through the cracks. All they did was blur your vision when you needed to see clearly. Eleanor turned back to her sewing, picking up Mrs. Hartley's dress with steady hands. The light was failing, but she knew every stitch by feel. She'd finish this piece tonight, collect her $1.30 tomorrow, $1.30 toward 300. The arithmetic was laughable, but she did it anyway, the way a drowning person counts the number of breaths they have left. Outside, the wind picked up, driving the first real snow of winter against the windows. Eleanor didn't look up. She had work to do, and no time for the luxury of despair. The needle moved in and out, each stitch a small act of defiance against the cold and the dark and the relentless passage of days. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the lowing of cattle being driven to shelter. The Longhorn Hill Ranch, probably moving their herds to winter pasture. She'd heard the ranch's owner was a hard man, someone who'd come back from the war with shadows in his eyes and a fortune in Union gold. Caleb Rowe, that was his name. She'd seen him in town once or twice, a tall figure who moved through the streets like he was still walking through battlefields, aware of every sight line, every potential ambush. The ranchers would survive the winter. They always did. They had cattle and cowboys and deep pockets, while she had a needle, thread, and a house that groaned under the weight of memory. Eleanor Bishop bent over her work as the darkness gathered, her fingers never stopping their careful dance. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't beg. She would simply endure, one stitch at a time, until spring came to collect what she couldn't pay. The morning sun cast long shadows across the frozen ground as Caleb Rowe stood at the edge of his property, watching his breath cloud in the bitter air. Below him, Longhorn Hill Ranch spread out like a kingdom built from sweat and stubbornness, 3,000 acres of prime grazing land, 500 head of cattle, and a 2-story house that stood like a fortress against the Wyoming wind. He'd been up since 4, the old habit from his army days, refusing to die even after 17 years. Sleep came hard to men who'd seen too much, and Caleb had seen plenty. The war had ended when he was barely 17, but some wars never really end. They just change battlefields. His foreman, Jake Hawley, rode up leading Caleb's horse, a black gelding named Silas. "Boss, we got them strays rounded up from the north pasture. Lost about 6 head in that gulch during the storm." Caleb nodded, swinging into the saddle with practiced ease despite the twinge in his back. The scar tissue pulled tight in the cold, a parting gift from a Confederate bayonet at Chancellorsville. Some days it barely troubled him. Other days, like today, it served as a reminder that he'd survived when better men hadn't. They rode in silence through the ranch, checking fence lines and water sources. The cattle huddled together against the wind, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Caleb had built this herd from nothing. Started with 20 scrawny longhorns driven up from Texas and turned them into some of the finest beef cattle in the territory. People in town whispered about where he'd gotten his stake Union gold. They said, or worse, let them whisper. The dead didn't care about gossip. "Heard Judge Morrison was making rounds yesterday," Jake said, breaking the silence. "Tax time coming due for the smaller holdings. Caleb's jaw tightened. He knew what that meant. Harvey Lamont at the bank had been circling like a vulture for months, picking off the small ranchers and farmers one by one. The railroad rumors had every speculator in 3 counties fevered with greed. The widow Bishop got a visit. Jake continued, watching his boss from the corner of his eye. $300 by spring, they say. Caleb had seen Eleanor Bishop in town, a slight figure in gray who moved through the streets like a ghost. He'd heard about her husband's death in the mine collapse. Same accident that killed 8 other men. She'd stood at the memorial like a statue carved from granite, tearless while the other widows wept. There was something about that kind of controlled grief that he recognized, the way a soldier recognizes another soldier even out of uniform. "That's her business," Caleb said curtly. They reached the eastern boundary of the ranch, where it bordered the Bishop property. The fence line was clear, but Caleb reined in Silas, studying the small house in the distance. Smoke barely trickled from the chimney, not enough wood. Or she was rationing it. The stable stood empty, door banging in the wind. Sarah would have helped her, Jake said quietly. The name hit Caleb like a physical blow. Sarah, even after 5 years, her name could still stop him cold. She died while he was away buying cattle in Colorado, died of a fever that took her in 3 days. By the time he'd gotten word and raced home, she was already in the ground, buried in the small cemetery behind the church. "Sarah's dead," Caleb said flatly, "and Charity didn't save her." Jake fell silent. He'd been with Caleb since the beginning, knew when to push and when to retreat. They turned the horses back toward the ranch house, riding through land that Caleb had bought with blood money and determination. Every acre represented a choice to survive, to build something from the ashes of what he'd lost. The house came into view, solid and imposing with its wraparound porch and tall windows. Sarah had designed it, sketched it out on paper during those first hard years when they lived in a one-room cabin. "When we're rich," she'd say, laughing, "we'll have a real parlor and a library and windows so big we can see forever." He'd built it all after she died, every room exactly as she'd drawn it, and now he rattled around in it like a ghost haunting his own life. In the barn, Caleb unsaddled Silas, his movements automatic. The other ranch hands gave him a wide berth. They respected him, feared him a little, but none of them knew him. He'd made sure of that. Attachment was a luxury he couldn't afford. He'd loved 2 things in his life. The war had taken his brother, and fever had taken Sarah. The lesson was clear enough. Mr. Rowe. Caleb turned to find Pete, one of the younger cowboys, shifting nervously from foot to foot. "What is it?" "That new bull you bought, he's tore up pretty bad. Looks like he tried to jump the fence and got tangled in the wire." Caleb cursed under his breath. The bull had cost him $300, ironic, the same amount that would save the widow Bishop's land. He followed Pete to the holding pen where the animal stood, blood dripping from several deep gashes. "Get the medical kit," Caleb ordered, already rolling up his sleeves. He'd doctored enough wounded to know what needed doing. As he worked, cleaning and stitching the wounds, his mind wandered to that small house on the border of his property. $300. Nothing to him, everything to her. But charity was a trap. He'd learned that young. People took what you gave and resented you for it. Or worse, came to depend on it. Better to stand alone. Better to need no one and be needed by no one. The bull bellowed as he pulled the last stitch tight. "Easy, boy," Caleb murmured. "You'll heal. Everything heals if you give it enough time and leave it alone." That night, Caleb sat in his library, Sarah's library. Really, though she'd never seen it, nursing a glass of whiskey. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing. He tried to read, but the words swam on the page. Instead, he found himself at the window, looking out toward the eastern boundary. No light showed from the Bishop house. Either she'd gone to bed early or was sitting in the dark to save oil. He remembered doing the same thing those first years after the war, when every penny mattered and pride was all that stood between a man and begging. Caleb turned away from the window, angry at himself for caring. He had 3,000 acres to manage, 500 cattle to keep alive through winter, and 15 employees depending on him for their livelihood. What happened to one widow on a 20-acre plot was none of his concern. But as he climbed the stairs to his empty bedroom, past the parlor Sarah had never seen and the nursery that had never held a child, Caleb couldn't shake the image of Eleanor Bishop standing at her husband's memorial. That rigid spine, those dry eyes, the way she'd held herself apart from comfort or pity. He knew that posture. It was the stance of someone who'd learned that showing weakness invited only more pain. Someone who'd discovered that the world was full of Harvey Lamonts, circling and waiting for you to stumble. In his bedroom, Caleb opened the drawer of his nightstand and pulled out a bundle of letters, yellow with age. Letters he'd written to Sarah from Colorado. Letters that had arrived after she was already gone. He'd never sent them. Of course, what was the point of words to the dead? Outside, the wind continued its assault on the house, and somewhere to the east, a widow sat alone in the dark, stitching other people's clothes to pay for land her dead husband had loved. Caleb put the letters away and lay down in his too large bed, staring at the ceiling. The war had taught him many things, but perhaps the most important was this: every man dies alone, whether in a muddy field in Virginia or a coal mine in Wyoming. The best you could hope for was to build something that outlasted you, something the wind and the bankers and the bitter cold couldn't take away. But as sleep finally claimed him, Caleb Rowe found himself thinking not of cattle or land or even Sarah, but of a woman in gray who refused to cry, and the $300 that stood between her and the abyss. The Dust Valley Bank stood like a monument to prosperity on Main Street, its brick facade and brass fixtures declaring permanence in a town built mostly of wood and hope. Eleanor Bishop paused outside, steeling herself for what lay ahead. She'd worn her best dress, the black wool she'd made for Thomas's funeral, and pinned her hair severely back. If she must face Harvey Lamont, she would do so with dignity intact. The bell above the door announced her arrival with cheerful malice. The bank's interior smelled of pipe tobacco and leather, of money and men's ambitions. Two ranchers stood at the teller window, their spurs clicking on the polished floor. One of them, she recognized him as Caleb Rowe from Longhorn Hill, turned slightly at her entrance. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second before Eleanor looked away, focusing on the door to Harvey Lamont's office. Mrs. Bishop. The teller, young Samuel Morrison, the judge's nephew, gave her a sympathetic look. Mr. Lamont is expecting you. She hadn't made an appointment, but of course Harvey expected her. He expected all of them eventually, the small landowners who couldn't weather bad seasons or family tragedies. She knocked on his door, hearing his oily "come in" with a shudder of distaste. Harvey Lemon sat behind his mahogany desk like a toad on a lily pad, all stomach and self-satisfaction. His office was ostentatiously decorated Persian rug, leather-bound books he'd never read, a portrait of himself looking nobler than God ever intended. He didn't stand when she entered. "Eleanor, how nice to see you. Please, sit." She remained standing. "Mr. Lamont, I assume you've come about the tax situation. Judge Morrison told me he'd spoken with you." He leaned back, his chair creaking under the strain. "I'm prepared to make my offer more generous. $120 for the deed. Cash money today. The land is worth 5 times that." "Was worth 5 times that," Harvey corrected, his smile never wavering. "Before your husband died, before the taxes came due. Value is all about timing, my dear." Eleanor's hands clenched in her skirts. "I'll pay the taxes." $300 by April. He laughed, a sound like grease spattering. "Come now. Your sewing brings in, what, $10 a month, 15 in a good month. Even if you didn't eat or heat your home, you couldn't save enough." "That's my concern." Harvey's eyes narrowed. "Pride is a luxury you can't afford. Think practically. $120 would set you up nicely. Mrs. Dully has a lovely room available, perfect for a respectable widow. You could continue your sewing work, live comfortably. As your tenant, the words came out sharp. In a room you own, in a boarding house you own, paying you rent with money you paid me for land my husband died working to keep. His face flushed red. I'm trying to help you, woman. No, you're trying to steal from me with a pen instead of a gun. Eleanor turned to leave. Good day, Mr. Lamont. $100, he called after her. My original offer stands until Christmas. After that, she heard his chair creak as he stood. After that, I'll simply wait for the auction. I'll get your land either way. Eleanor, the only question is whether you'll have anything left when I do. Eleanor walked out, her spine straight, her steps measured. She passed through the bank's main room, aware of the eyes on her, the tellers, the customers, everyone watching the widow's futile stand against inevitability. At the door, she nearly collided with Caleb Rowe. He stepped aside, touching his hat brim. Ma'am. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and pushed through the door into the cold December air. Behind her, she heard Harvey's voice boom out, Ah, Mr. Rowe, just the man I wanted to see. About that grazing lease we discussed. Eleanor walked quickly down Main Street, past the Mercantile where she couldn't afford to shop, past the hotel where travelers stayed on their way to somewhere better. The wind cut through her wool dress like paper. She'd sold her heavy cloak last winter. At the corner of Main and Cedar, she stopped, gripping the wooden post of the street sign until her knuckles went white. The encounter had gone exactly as she'd expected. Yet somehow Harvey's smugness still caught her off guard, that horrible certainty in his voice. I'll get your land either way. And Mrs. Bishop. She turned to find Caleb Rowe standing a few feet away, his black horse tied to the post. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair. He was younger than she'd thought, perhaps only a few years older than herself, but he wore his years heavy. Mr. Rowe. She straightened, trying to compose herself. I couldn't help but overhear. He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. That is, Lamont's voice carries... Heat rose in her cheeks. Of course he'd heard. Everyone in the bank had heard Harvey spelling out her desperation in dollars and cents. If you'll excuse me, she said, starting to move past him. He's planning something. The words were quiet, meant only for her. The railroad talk is more than talk. I've seen the survey markers myself, out past Miller's Creek. Your land sits right where they'll need to put the depot. Eleanor stopped. Why are you telling me this? Caleb looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight like a man unused to involving himself in others' affairs. Because he offered me the same grazing lease 6 months ago, before your tax troubles started. He's been planning this, waiting for an excuse to force you out. And what difference does that make? I still can't pay the taxes. It makes a difference to how you fight. His gray eyes met hers directly. And whether you fight at all. Eleanor studied him, this taciturn rancher with his reputation for coldness. She'd heard the stories how he'd come back from the war with blood on his hands and gold in his pockets, how he'd built his empire on the bones of Confederate dead, how his fiancée had died while he was away, and he'd never so much as looked at another woman since. Do you think I'm not fighting? She asked softly. I think you're fighting alone. He glanced back toward the bank. Lamont counts on that. It's how men like him win. And are you offering to help, Mr. Rowe? The question came out more bitter than she intended. Going to swoop in and save the poor widow? I've had enough of men's charity. Thank you. His face closed off, the momentary openness vanishing like smoke. No, ma'am. Just thought you should know what you're up against. He untied his horse, swinging up into the saddle with easy grace. Good day, Mrs. Bishop. Eleanor watched him ride away, anger and embarrassment warring in her chest. She'd been ungracious. She knew. But the thought of accepting help becoming another person's charity project made her skin crawl. She'd rather lose everything than become a debt in someone else's ledger. By the time she reached home, the sun was already sinking toward the horizon. The house felt colder than ever, as if Harvey's words had followed her home and settled into the walls. She built a meager fire, using only 2 precious pieces of wood, and sat down to her sewing. But her hands shook, and she had to rip out 3 seams before she could complete one. Caleb Rowe's words echoed in her mind. "It's how men like him win." Was she a fool, standing on pride while Harvey Lamont drew his net tighter? Outside her window, she could see the lights of Longhorn Hill Ranch in the distance, warm and numerous as stars. Somewhere over there, Caleb Rowe was probably sitting down to a hot meal in a heated room, having done his good deed for the day by warning the stubborn widow about the vulture circling her door. Eleanor forced her attention back to her sewing. She had Mrs. Hartley's dress to finish, and 2 shirts for the Bronson boys, and a torn coat for old Mr. Weatherby. $10 worth of work if she was lucky, 15 if Mrs. Hartley was feeling generous, $290 short of salvation. But as she sewed by the dying light, Eleanor found herself thinking not about money or land or even Thomas, but about the look in Caleb Rowe's eyes when he'd said she was fighting alone. There had been something there, recognition, perhaps, or understanding. The look of someone who knew what it was like to stand against the world with nothing but will to hold you upright. She shook her head, driving the needle through fabric with renewed determination. Whatever battles Caleb Rowe had fought, they had nothing to do with her. She would save herself or she would fall. But either way, she would do it on her own terms. Harvey Lamont might get her land, but he would never get the satisfaction of seeing her beg. The fire died to embers as she worked on through the darkness, her fingers finding their way by touch and habit. Outside, snow began to fall, covering the world in a blank white shroud. But inside Eleanor Bishop's small house, the needle continued its steady rhythm, each stitch a small rebellion against the coming spring. The sound of splintering wood woke Eleanor from restless sleep. She lay still in the pre-dawn darkness, listening. There it was again, a crack and groan that didn't belong to the familiar complaints of her old house. Rising quickly, she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and crept to the kitchen window. By the faint moonlight reflecting off snow, she could see them, a dozen cattle milling about in her back garden, their heavy bodies pushing through what remained of her fence. The wooden rails lay scattered like matchsticks, and the beasts were trampling through her small vegetable plot, destroying the cold frames she'd built to protect her winter cabbages. Eleanor grabbed Thomas's old shotgun from above the door, unloaded. Had been for months since she'd sold the ammunition and stepped out into the bitter cold. "Get on, get out of there." The cattle, longhorns by the look of them, merely turned their massive heads to regard her with mild interest. One continued chewing on what might have been the last of her turnip greens. "I said get." She waved the useless gun, knowing how foolish she must look, a woman in her nightdress, brandishing an empty weapon at animals that outweighed her by half a ton each. "Whoa there, easy now." The voice came from beyond the broken fence. Caleb Rowe emerged from the darkness astride his black horse, followed by 2 of his ranch hands. Even in the poor light, Eleanor could see his frown as he surveyed the damage. "Jake, we'll get them back through. Watch that bull, he's got a temper." He dismounted, approaching Eleanor with the same caution he might show a spooked horse. "Ma'am, you might want to put that gun down before someone gets the wrong idea." Eleanor lowered the shotgun, but didn't retreat. "Your cattle destroyed my fence, my garden. I can see that." He pulled off his leather gloves, studying the wreckage. Storm must have spooked them. They pushed through the north pasture gate and kept going. He turned to her, and she realized he was trying not to look at her state of undress, keeping his eyes firmly on her face. "I'll have my men repair the fence first thing tomorrow. Tonight, if you prefer." "That's not..." Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter, acutely aware of her bare feet in the snow, her hair hanging loose around her shoulders. "I can't pay for repairs." "My cattle, my responsibility." His tone brooked no argument. "Jake, bring some lanterns. We'll need to see what we're doing." "It's 4 a.m, Eleanor protested. "And you're standing barefoot in the snow." He shrugged out of his heavy coat and held it out to her. "Please." She wanted to refuse, but her feet were already numb. Pride was a poor defense against frostbite. She took the coat, enveloped immediately in warmth and the scent of leather and wood smoke. The ranch hands worked efficiently, corralling the cattle back through the gap. Caleb walked the fence line with a lantern, assessing the damage with quick expertise. Eleanor retreated to her doorway, watching despite herself. "Mrs. Bishop," he called. "Might I trouble you for some water for the men when they're done? It's thirsty work." It was an excuse, she knew, to make her feel less like a charity case, as if she were doing them the favor. "Of course. I'll put coffee on." Inside, Eleanor dressed hastily, pinning her hair back with shaking fingers. Through the window, she could see the men working, hear the low murmur of their voices and the occasional lowing of cattle. By the time she had coffee brewing and had located her few remaining cups, they were setting the last rail in place. She opened the door to find Caleb on her porch, hat in hand. "Temporary fix, but it'll hold. I'll send a crew tomorrow with proper materials." "There's coffee," she said, the words stiff and formal. "For your men." Jake and Will accepted their cups gratefully, warming their hands on the tin. They stood awkwardly in her small kitchen, trying to take up as little space as possible. Caleb remained by the door, as if he didn't trust himself to come further inside. "About your garden," he began. "It's done. No use talking about it." "I'll compensate you for the loss." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "I told you, I don't want—" "My cattle destroyed your property. Where I come from, a man makes that right." His gray eyes were steady on hers. "Unless you'd prefer I send Harvey Lamont a bill, I'm sure he'd be happy to add it to your account." The bitter humor in his voice surprised her. Eleanor found herself almost smiling. "You don't like him either." "Harvey Lamont is a parasite in a suit." Caleb set his cup down carefully. "Thank you for the coffee. Ma'am, we'll be going." But as he turned to leave, Eleanor noticed his slight limp, more pronounced than usual. "You're hurt." He glanced down at his leg. "Old injury, X up in the cold." "Sit." The word came out as an order, surprising them both. "I have liniment. It's the least I can do after you fixed my fence." Caleb looked like he might argue, but Jake was already pushing him toward a chair. "Do as the lady says. Boss, you've been favoring that leg all week." Eleanor fetched the liniment from her medicine box, the same salve she used to make for Thomas when his mining work left him sore. Caleb rolled up his trouser leg, revealing an old scar that ran from knee to ankle, the tissue white and ropey. "Shrapnel?" she asked, warming the liniment between her palms. "Bayonet, Chancellorsville." Her hands stilled for a moment. Thomas had a cousin who died at Chancellorsville. The war seemed to have touched everyone, leaving its marks on the survivors like a signature. She worked in silence, her fingers gentle but firm as she massaged the liniment into the damaged muscle. Caleb sat perfectly still, but she could feel the tension in him, a man unaccustomed to being tended. "Your husband," he said suddenly. "He was a good man. I bought horses from him once, before—" He trailed off. "Before he decided mining paid better than ranching." Eleanor kept her voice neutral. "He thought it would be quicker money, enough to expand, maybe buy some breeding stock." Her hands continued their work. "He was underground when the shaft collapsed. They said it was quick." "Were you there when they brought him up?" Eleanor's hands paused. No one had ever asked her that. They'd asked if she was all right, if she needed anything, if she wanted to see the body, but no one had asked if she was there. "Yes." The word came out rough. I waited 16 hours at the mine entrance. Some of the wives gave up, went home, but I waited. I knew. She swallowed hard. I knew he was dead, but I waited anyway. When they finally brought him up, his face was so peaceful, like he was sleeping. Caleb's hand covered hers. Just for a moment. You loved him. I did. She pulled back, capping the liniment. That should help with the stiffness. He rolled down his trouser leg, standing carefully. Thank you. Jake and Will had already left. Eleanor realized. She and Caleb were alone in her kitchen, the coffee cooling between them. Outside, dawn was beginning to break, painting the snow-covered world in shades of rose and gold. I should go, Caleb said, but he made no move toward the door. Your coat, Eleanor remembered, starting to shrug it off. Keep it for now. I'll send someone for it tomorrow. He paused at the threshold. Lock your door. Mrs. Bishop, there are worse things than cattle that wander in the night. After he left, Eleanor stood in her kitchen, wrapped in a coat that smelled of another life, one where fences stayed whole and gardens grew undisturbed. Through the window, she watched him ride away, his men flanking him, the rescued cattle plodding along behind. The fence stood straight and true, a line of defense against the encroaching world. It would hold for now, Caleb had said, but Eleanor knew better than most that temporary fixes were just another form of delay. Come spring, Harvey Lamont would take her land, and no amount of mended fences could stop him. Still, as she cleared away the coffee cups and banked the fire, Eleanor felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the warmth of human kindness, freely given. Caleb Rowe had asked for nothing, expected nothing. He'd simply seen a wrong and tried to right it. She hung his coat on the peg by the door, where Thomas's coat used to hang. For the first time in 2 years, the empty peg didn't look like an accusation. It looked like possibility. Outside, the sun climbed higher, melting the frost from her windows. Eleanor Bishop sat down to her sewing, but her thoughts kept straying to gray eyes and gentle hands, to a man who walked through the world carrying his own weight of sorrow. She didn't know what would come of this strange morning, but for now, she had strong coffee in her belly, a mended fence around her garden, and the lingering warmth of unexpected grace. It was enough. For today, it was enough. The snow came early that year, falling in thick curtains that turned the world white and silent. Eleanor stood at her kitchen window, watching Caleb Rowe's broad back as he split wood in her side yard. He'd been coming by for 2 weeks now, always with some excuse checking the fence, delivering a haunch of venison his men had extra, fixing a loose board on her porch. Today, he'd simply shown up with an axe and started splitting her meager woodpile into kindling. You don't have to do that, she'd told him, as she told him every time. Snow's coming heavy, he'd replied, as if that explained everything. Now she watched him work, the steady rhythm of his movements, the way his breath clouded in the cold air. He'd removed his coat despite the temperature, and she could see the play of muscle beneath his flannel shirt. It was an intimacy she hadn't expected watching a man work, learning the particular way he moved through the world. When he finished, he stacked the wood neatly by her door, far more than she'd had before. Eleanor met him on the porch with coffee, a ritual that had developed without either of them acknowledging it. Thank you, she said simply. He accepted the cup, his fingers brushing hers. Neither of them pulled away as quickly as they might have 2 weeks ago. Storm's going to be a bad one. You have enough food laid by. I'll manage. Caleb frowned. He'd learned to read the careful neutrality in her voice, the way she held herself when pride was all that stood between her and admission of need. I have business in town tomorrow. Thought I might stop by the mercantile. Caleb. His name felt strange on her tongue. Intimate. They'd moved to first names gradually. Another unacknowledged shift. I can't keep taking. Then don't take trade. He set down his cup. pulled a folded paper from his pocket. I need new work shirts. Mine are about worn through. Jake suggested I ask you. Eleanor unfolded the paper, seeing measurements written in a careful hand. She knew he could buy shirts ready-made from the catalog, probably finer than anything she could sew. But here he was, offering her work, offering her dignity. 3 shirts, she said, keeping her voice businesslike. That's $12 worth of work. 15. I want them double-stitched. They need to last. Before she could protest the overpayment, he was already heading for his horse. I'll bring the fabric tomorrow, before the storm hits. Eleanor watched him ride away. The paper crumpled in her hand. $15. Added to what she'd saved, it brought her to $53. Still impossibly short of $300. But it was something. That night, the wind picked up, whistling through the boards and rattling the windows. Eleanor built the fire higher than usual. Using the wood Caleb had split, the house felt warmer than it had in months. And not just from the flames. She'd finished Mrs. Patterson's dress and started on a christening gown for the Wheelers' new baby when she heard it music. Faint but distinct, carried on the wind. Eleanor went to the window, peering out into the swirling snow. There, barely visible through the storm, was a figure on the road. As it drew closer, she recognized Caleb's horse, and then Caleb himself. Hunched against the wind, he was playing a harmonica, the lonely melody threading through the storm like a lifeline. Eleanor threw open the door. What are you doing out in this? He looked up. Snowflakes caught in his eyelashes. Came to town for supplies. Storm came faster than expected. He held up a canvas sack. Flour, coffee, some canned goods. Thought you might. Get inside before you freeze. She practically pulled him through the door. His clothes were soaked through, ice forming on his beard. Are you mad, traveling in this weather? Wanted to make sure you were set before it got worse. His teeth were chattering. My horse threw a shoe about a mile back. Had to walk him in. Eleanor's scolding died on her lips. He'd risked himself to bring her supplies. Sit by the fire. I'll tend your horse. I can... Sit. She grabbed Thomas's old coat from its peg. I know how to stable a horse. Caleb Rowe. Outside, the storm was indeed worsening. Eleanor led the exhausted animal to her small stable, rubbing him down and covering him with the old blankets she'd kept from Thomas's horse. The beast whickered softly, grateful for the shelter. When she returned, she found Caleb had stoked the fire and was standing close to it, steam rising from his wet clothes. He'd pulled off his boots and set them to dry. You'll catch your death. Eleanor said, those clothes need to come off. Color rose in his cheeks. I'm fine. You're not fine. You're half frozen and too stubborn to admit it. She went to her bedroom, returning with a quilt and Thomas's old robe. Put this on. I'll hang your clothes to dry. For a moment, she thought he'd refuse. Then another shiver ran through him, and practicality won. Turn around. Eleanor busied herself making fresh coffee, while rustling sounds told her he was changing. When she turned back, he was wrapped in the robe and quilt, looking oddly vulnerable. She'd never seen him as anything but completely composed, armor-plated in competence and distance. Now, sitting by her fire with his hair damp and his defenses down, he seemed younger, more human. The harmonica, she said, hanging his clothes carefully near the fire. I didn't know you played. Learned during the war, past the time between, he shrugged. Between things better forgotten. Eleanor poured coffee, added a precious spoonful of sugar to his cup without asking. She'd noticed he had a sweet tooth, though he tried to hide it. Play something now. He looked surprised. You want to hear it? The storm's going to trap us here for hours. Might as well have music. Caleb pulled the harmonica from the pocket of his hanging coat. His fingers found their places, and he began to play not the mournful tune from outside, but something lighter, almost dancing. Eleanor found herself swaying slightly as she returned to her sewing. They sat like that as the storm raged outside, Caleb playing and Eleanor working, the fire crackling between them. Sometimes he paused to drink coffee or add wood to the fire. Sometimes she looked up from her work to find him watching her, his expression unreadable. Sarah loved music, he said suddenly, the harmonica silent in his hands. She had a piano, brought it all the way from St. Louis, used to play in the evenings while I did the accounts. Eleanor's needle paused. He rarely spoke of his lost fiancée. What happened to it? It's in the house, in the parlor she designed but never saw. His voice was matter-of-fact, but Eleanor heard the pain beneath. I keep it tuned, don't know why. Because you loved her. Yes, he met her eyes. But she's been gone 5 years, and I'm tired of living with ghosts. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Eleanor felt her heart skip, a sensation she'd thought dead with Thomas. Ghosts can be comfortable companions. They don't ask anything of you. No, Caleb agreed. They just keep you frozen in place, like insects in amber, pretty to look at, but not alive. Eleanor set down her sewing. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, but inside, the world had shrunk to this circle of firelight, these two damaged people carefully circling around something neither quite dared name. I should check on dinner, she said, needing distance from the intensity in his eyes. You'll stay. Of course. Can't send you back out in this. Eleanor. Her name on his lips stopped her. I didn't come here just because of the storm. She waited, her back to him, her hands gripping the table edge. I came because I wanted to see you, to make sure you were warm and fed and... He paused, searching for words. And not alone. The storm was an excuse. Eleanor closed her eyes. Don't, please. Don't what? Don't make me hope. The words came out raw. I can bear the cold and the hunger and even losing the land, but I can't bear hoping for something that will only be taken away. She heard him stand, heard his bare feet on the floor. Then his hands were on her shoulders, gentle but firm, turning her to face him. What if it isn't taken away? What if some things are given to stay? Eleanor looked up at him, this man who'd carved himself a place in her life through small kindnesses and stubborn persistence. I don't know how to do this anymore. How to let someone... Neither do I. His thumb brushed her cheek, catching a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. But maybe we can learn together. Maybe we can choose to be alive instead of just surviving. The storm raged on. But inside Eleanor Bishop's small house, something else was beginning tentative and fragile as new growth through snow, but real. She leaned into his touch, just slightly, and felt him breathe out like a man who'd been holding his breath for years. They stood there, caught between one life and another, while the fire crackled and the coffee cooled and the future waited, patient as spring. Eleanor found the letters by accident. She was returning Caleb's mended shirts, carefully wrapped in brown paper, when the wind caught the barn door and slammed it against the side of his wagon. The impact knocked over a wooden crate, spilling its contents across the hay-strewn floor. Letters, dozens of them, tied in small bundles with faded ribbon. The top one had come partially undone, revealing elegant handwriting, "My dearest Caleb." Oh, Eleanor knelt quickly, gathering the scattered pages. She shouldn't look, knew it was wrong, but her eyes caught fragments despite herself. Wait for your return. The house you promised? Forever yours. Sarah. Leave them. Caleb's voice from the doorway made her freeze. He stood silhouetted against the afternoon light, his expression unreadable. I'm sorry, the wind. Eleanor gestured helplessly at the open crate. I wasn't trying to pry. He moved past her, kneeling to collect the letters with careful hands. I was bringing them to burn. Should have done it years ago. Don't. The word escaped before Eleanor could stop it. Caleb looked up sharply. Why shouldn't I? Because she loved you. Because you loved her. Because burning the letters won't change that. Eleanor hesitated, then continued softly. I kept Thomas's work gloves. Foolish, really. They're worn through, no use to anyone. But sometimes I hold them and remember his hands. Caleb sat back on his heels, a bundle of letters cradled in his palms. These aren't even the letters she sent. They're the ones I wrote from Colorado, the ones that arrived after she died. His laugh was bitter. 43 letters to a dead woman? The postmaster kept them, gave them back when I returned. Eleanor said nothing, recognizing the sacred space of grief. She'd learned that sometimes the best comfort was simply bearing witness. I told her about the cattle prices, the men I'd hired, the furniture I'd ordered for the house. He touched one letter gently. This one describes the curtains I'd seen in Denver, blue flowers on white cotton. She always wanted blue curtains. Did you put them in the house? Every window. He began placing the letters back in the crate. Movements deliberate. Just like she wanted. Piano in the parlor, kitchen facing east for morning light. Library with built-in shelves. He paused. I built her a tomb and called it a house. Eleanor watched him replace the lid on the crate. Or maybe you built her a love letter. One that couldn't blow away. Caleb's hands stilled. He turned to look at her then. Really look at her. And Eleanor felt exposed under that gray gaze. Is that what you think? I think we do what we must to survive loss. Some people build houses. Some people keep old gloves. She stood, brushing hay from her skirts. Neither is wrong. He rose too, the crate held against his chest like armor. They stood facing each other in the dusty barn, afternoon light slanting between them. Eleanor could hear horses shifting in their stalls, could smell hay and leather and the faint scent of Caleb's shaving soap. I dream about her less, he said suddenly. Since I've been coming to see you, I used to dream about her every night. Eleanor's heart contracted. I'm not her, Caleb. I won't try to be. I know. He set the crate on a shelf, high up where it would be safe. That's why I can finally let her rest. They walked back toward the house together, not touching but aware of each other in that heightened way of two people discovering they might matter to one another. Eleanor had left the shirts in the wagon, and she retrieved them now, holding the package out to him. 3 shirts, double-stitched as requested. He took the package, his fingers lingering over hers. Have dinner with me. I should get back. Please. The word was soft but urgent. The house is too quiet, has been for years. Eleanor looked at him, this man who'd built a monument to lost love and lived in it like a penitent. She thought of her own empty house, the silence that pressed against her ears at night. All right. The Longhorn Hill Ranch house was everything Thomas had dreamed of, building 2 stories of solid construction with windows that caught the light and rooms that spoke of permanence. Eleanor tried not to compare, tried not to imagine what her life might have been if Thomas had lived, if their dreams had taken shape in wood and stone. It's beautiful, she said, meaning it. It's a house. Caleb led her to the kitchen, which was indeed facing east as he'd said. Never been a home. He moved around the space with surprising efficiency, pulling out ingredients for a simple meal. Eleanor found herself at the stove beside him, falling into the easy rhythm of shared cooking. She peeled potatoes while he seasoned the beef. He sliced bread while she stirred the gravy. They moved around each other like dancers who'd practiced for years. You cook well for a bachelor, Eleanor observed. Army taught me, then years of batch cooking before I could afford a cook. He smiled slightly. Maria comes 3 times a week now, but I still prefer doing it myself sometimes. They ate in the kitchen rather than the formal dining room, the atmosphere warm and comfortable. Caleb told her about his plans for spring new breeding stock from Texas, expanding the eastern pasture. Eleanor found herself responding with her own knowledge. Things Thomas had taught her about land management and cattle that she'd thought forgotten. You know ranching, Caleb said, surprised. Thomas grew up on a ranch in Nebraska. He had ideas. She trailed off, then forced herself to continue. He thought mining would give us the money to start. Quick fortune, then back to the land. He was so sure. We're all sure until we're not. Caleb poured coffee from the pot on the stove. I was sure the war would last 6 months. Sure Sarah would wait. Sure I'd come home whole. He touched his leg unconsciously. 3 lies for the price of believing. After dinner, he showed her the house not proudly, but like a man revealing scars. Here was the parlor with its blue curtains and silent piano. Here was the library with empty shelves he'd never filled. Here was the staircase with a newel post carved in the shape of a rising sun. Because she loved mornings. Eleanor followed, understanding that this was a different kind of intimacy than their moment by the fire. This was Caleb opening the door to his past, trusting her to walk through without judgment. They ended up in the library, where a fire crackled in the grate and 2 leather chairs faced each other across a small table. Eleanor settled into one, accepting the glass of whiskey Caleb offered. She rarely drank, but tonight seemed to call for it. I found the letters because I was cleaning out the barn, he said eventually. Getting ready. For what? To live again, or try. He stared into his glass. 5 years is a long time to be a ghost in your own life. Eleanor thought of her own 2 years of widowhood, how they'd felt like a lifetime and an instant simultaneously. Sometimes I forget he's gone. I'll think of something to tell him, turn to speak, and the empty space is like a slap. Does it get easier? No, just more familiar. She sipped the whiskey, felt it burn warm down her throat. But lately, there have been moments when I forget to hurt, when I'm just Eleanor, not Thomas's widow. She looked at him across the small space. Usually when you're around. Caleb set down his glass, leaned forward. I don't want you to forget him. He was part of you, made you who you are. He struggled for words. I want to be part of who you're becoming. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, night was falling, and Eleanor knew she should leave. Knew the proper thing was to ask for a ride home, to maintain the careful boundaries that protected reputations in a small town. Instead, she said, show me the piano. They returned to the parlor, where the piano sat like a sleeping creature under a dust cover. Caleb pulled off the cloth, revealing polished mahogany that gleamed in the lamplight. The bench still held sheet music, Beautiful Dreamer, Jeannie with the light brown hair. Play something, Eleanor said. I don't play, never learned. She moved to the bench, ran her fingers over the keys. I had lessons as a girl before we came west. She picked out a simple melody, rusty but recognizable. Thomas loved to hear me play, said it reminded him of civilized places. The notes hung in the air. Not quite a song, but the ghost of one. Caleb stood behind her, close enough that she could feel his warmth. Teach me, he said quietly. Something simple. Eleanor shifted on the bench, making room. He sat beside her, their thighs touching through layers of fabric. She positioned his hands on the keys, trying to ignore the way her pulse quickened at the contact. Like this, feel for the weight of the key, the resistance before it drops. She guided his fingers through a basic scale, then a simple melody. He was a quick student, his hands sure despite their unfamiliarity with the task. Soon they were playing together, her right hand carrying the melody while his left found a basic harmony. Sarah would have liked you, he said suddenly. Eleanor's hand stilled. You don't have to say that. It's true. She appreciated strength in women. Said too many females out here tried to pretend they were still in Boston parlors instead of accepting what the frontier demanded. He touched a key gently, producing a single clear note. You've never pretended to be anything but what you are. A widow who can barely keep her house warm? A survivor who refuses to surrender. He turned on the bench to face her. Do you know what I thought the first time I saw you at Thomas's memorial? Eleanor shook her head. I thought, There's a woman who understands that tears are a luxury. You stood there like a soldier at attention, and I recognized myself. His hand covered hers on the keys. I've been looking for you in every face since, and only just realized it. The clock in the hall chimed 9. Eleanor knew she had to leave, knew staying longer would invite talk, but Caleb's hand was warm on hers, and the house that had felt like a tomb was starting to feel like possibility. "Take me home," she said softly, "but come for dinner tomorrow, my house this time." He smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "I'll bring the coffee. You're almost out." As they prepared to leave, Eleanor noticed he didn't cover the piano again. It sat open and ready, no longer a monument but an instrument waiting to make music, like the house itself, like the man beside her, who was finally choosing to live in the present instead of the past. The ride home was quiet, but it was the comfortable silence of two people who didn't need words. When they reached her door, Caleb helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist. "Tomorrow," he said, a promise and a question. "Tomorrow." Eleanor agreed, and went inside to a house that no longer felt quite so empty. Eleanor woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of crackling wood, but not from her fireplace. She bolted upright, immediately alert. The acrid scent was wrong, too chemical, too fierce. Through her window, she saw an orange glow dancing on the snow. The shed, the old tool shed behind her house, was ablaze, flames already licking up toward the main roof. She grabbed Thomas's coat and ran barefoot into the yard, the snow shocking against her skin. The fire was spreading fast, too fast to be accidental. As she stood frozen, calculating whether she could save anything, a figure emerged from the shadows near the well. Beautiful sight, isn't it? Will Morrison, one of Harvey Lamont's hired hands, stood watching the flames with satisfaction. "Mr. Lamont sends his regards. Says to consider this a warning. Sell now, or next time it won't be the shed." "You," Eleanor started toward him, fury overriding sense, but he was already mounting his horse. "Best get that fire out before it reaches the house. Widow. Would be a shame to lose everything." He tipped his hat mockingly and rode off into the darkness. Eleanor ran for the water buckets, knowing even as she did that it was hopeless. The shed was fully engulfed, and embers were falling on her roof like deadly snow. She threw what water she had, her nightgown soaking through, her hands already blistering from the heat. Then she heard it hoofbeats, fast and hard. Caleb appeared like an avenging angel. Jake and 2 other hands behind him. Without a word, they formed a bucket brigade from the well, Caleb taking the position closest to the flames. "The roof!" Eleanor shouted. "It's catching!" Caleb stripped off his coat and beat at the embers while his men continued throwing water. Eleanor found herself beside him, using a wet blanket to smother the spots where fire tried to take hold. The heat was overwhelming, the smoke choking, but she didn't stop. For what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, they fought. Finally, the shed collapsed in on itself, taking the worst of the fire with it. The house roof smoldered but held. Eleanor's legs gave out, and she sank into the snow, coughing. Caleb dropped beside her, his face streaked with soot. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to speak through the rawness in her throat. He pulled her against him, and she realized she was shaking from cold, from fear, from rage. "I saw the glow from the ranch," he said into her hair. "Thank God I couldn't sleep." "It was Will Morrison." Her voice came out cracked. He said it was a warning. From Harvey." Caleb's arms tightened around her. When he pulled back, his face was carved from stone. "Jake, take Mrs. Bishop inside. See to her hands." He stood, and Eleanor saw death in his eyes. "Tom, ride to town and wake the sheriff. Sam, you're with me." "Where are you going?" Eleanor struggled to her feet, Jake steadying her. "To have a conversation with Harvey Lamont." "No." She grabbed his arm. That's what he wants. You lose your temper, he'll have you arrested. Then who protects your ranch? Who protects... She stopped, but they both heard the unspoken, me. Caleb's jaw worked. She could see the war between rage and reason in his face. Finally, reason won. Jake, forget what I said. We all stay here tonight. He looked at Eleanor. All of us. They got her inside, where Jake tended her burned hands with gentle efficiency. Caleb built up the fire while his men took positions around the property guards against any return visit. Eleanor wanted to protest the invasion, but exhaustion was winning. Drink this. Caleb pressed a cup into her bandaged hands. Whiskey-laced coffee, sweet and strong. My shed, she said vaguely. All Thomas's tools were in there. We'll rebuild it. With what money? Bitter laughter escaped her. Harvey knows exactly what he's doing. Death by 1,000 cuts. A fence here, a shed there. How long before it's the house, before it's me? Caleb knelt before her chair, taking her hands carefully. It won't come to that. You can't watch my house every night? No, but I can make sure Harvey understands the cost of continuing this war. Eleanor searched his face. What are you planning? Harvey wants the land for the railroad depot. But the railroad needs more than just land. They need water rights, cattle contracts, cooperation from the established ranchers. His smile was sharp. I own the biggest ranch in 3 counties. My word carries weight with the railroad commissioners. You'd threaten your own business for me. I'd do more than that. He stood, pacing to the window where dawn was beginning to break. Eleanor, I need to say something, and I need you to let me finish. She waited, heart hammering. I've been a fool, courting you like we have all the time in the world, like Harvey Lamont isn't circling, like spring isn't coming with its tax bill. He turned to face her. I've been afraid of moving too fast, of dishonoring Sarah's memory, of assuming you could care for someone as damaged as me. Caleb, let me finish, please. He came back to her. Stood looking down with those gray eyes that had seen too much. I love you, not as a replacement for what I lost, not as a way to fill an empty house, but as you are, Eleanor Bishop, who won't cry in public, who mends clothes by candlelight to save oil, who stood beside me fighting fire in her nightgown like some warrior goddess. Eleanor's eyes burned with tears she wouldn't shed. This is the smoke talking, the fear. In the morning, I'll love you more, because you'll have had time to list all the reasons we're wrong for each other, and you'll still be here. He knelt again, taking her poor burned hands with infinite gentleness. Marry me. The word hung between them like a held breath. I can't. The words tore from her throat. I'm losing everything. I won't drag you down with me. You're not dragging me anywhere. I'm choosing to stand with you. The whole town will talk. They'll say I'm a fortune hunter, that I set my cap for you the moment Thomas died. Let them talk. They've been talking about me for years, war profiteer, cold bastard, the man who built a shrine to a dead woman. His thumbs traced circles on her wrists. I'm tired of living for other people's opinions. Eleanor looked at this man who'd appeared in her life like grace in a time of judgment. She thought of all the reasons to say no, the rushed timing, the gossip, the ghost of Sarah that might always linger between them. Then she thought of facing Harvey Lamont alone, of spring coming with its impossible bill, of nights spent cold and frightened and achingly lonely. But mostly she thought of the way Caleb looked at her not with pity or mere desire, but with recognition. The way one survivor looks at another and says, Yes, I see you. I know you. You are not alone. I won't wear her ring, Eleanor said finally. And I won't live in a house built for another woman. Then we'll build new, together, the way it should be. And you'll stop trying to save me. We save each other or not at all. Agreed. His smile was like sunrise. Is that a yes? Eleanor pulled him up, framed his soot-stained face with her bandaged hands. That's a yes. You foolish, stubborn, wonderful man. He kissed her then, there in her smoke-damaged parlor, with Jake keeping tactful watch outside and dawn breaking over a world that had tried to burn her down. She kissed him back with all the fervor of a woman choosing life over mere survival. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. We need to do this quick, before Harvey can move again. The ladies in town will be scandalized. A hasty wedding after a midnight fire. They'll invent all sorts of stories. Good. Let them have something interesting to discuss over their sewing circles. He pulled back, cupped her face. 3 days. Long enough to post the banns. Arrange things properly. 3 days. Eleanor felt dizzy at the speed of it all. This morning she'd been a widow facing ruin. Now she was an engaged woman with soot in her hair and hope in her heart. Jake knocked discreetly. Boss Ryder's coming. Looks like the sheriff. The real world intruded, bringing questions about the fire, Harvey's involvement, the threats to come. But as Eleanor stood beside Caleb to face whatever came next, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas died, the solid presence of someone who would not abandon her when things got hard. Outside, the ruins of the shed still smoldered, a black scar on the white snow, but the house stood strong, and in 3 days' time, she would no longer face Harvey Lamont's machinations alone. The fire had been meant to break her. Instead, it had forged something new and strong from the ashes of 2 broken lives. Eleanor Bishop would become Eleanor Rowe, and heaven help anyone who threatened what they would build together. The sheriff arrived, full of questions and skepticism, but with Caleb beside her, his men backing their story. Eleanor found her voice. She named Will Morrison, described the threat, stood firm against the implied suggestions that perhaps she'd been careless with a lantern. And when Harvey Lamont himself appeared an hour later, all false concern and oily sympathy, he found not a frightened widow, but a woman flanked by the most powerful rancher in the county, a woman whose eyes promised retribution for every burned board, every moment of fear. Such a tragedy, Harvey said, his piggy eyes taking in Caleb's protective stance. I do hope you'll reconsider my offer now, Mrs. Bishop, before anything worse happens. The only thing that's going to happen, Caleb said quietly, is a wedding. In 3 days' time. After that, any threats against my wife will be considered threats against me. He smiled. All teeth. I'm sure you understand what that means. Harvey's face went pale, then red. He'd overplayed his hand, and they all knew it. You can't protect her forever, Rowe. Watch me! The sheriff, sensing violence brewing, stepped between them. That's enough, Mr. Lamont. I'll need you to come to my office. Got some questions about your man Morrison and his whereabouts last night. As Harvey was led away, sputtering threats about lawyers and influence, Eleanor felt the last of her strength leave her, but Caleb was there, solid and sure, holding her up. Let's get you some rest, he murmured. We have a wedding to plan. 3 days. 3 days to end one life and begin another. Eleanor Bishop looked at the ashes of her shed, then at the man beside her, and chose hope over fear. The fire had come in the night, but morning had brought something better than rescue. It had brought love, unexpected and fierce as flame itself. And that, Eleanor thought as Caleb helped her back inside, was worth any amount of gossip the good ladies of Dust Valley could produce. The morning after the fire, Caleb stood before the assembled citizens of Dust Valley in the town square. Word had spread like wildfire Harvey Lamont's threats, the burning shed, the impending wedding. Half the town had gathered, drawn by scandal and spectacle. Eleanor stood on the boarding house porch, having spent the night there for propriety's sake. She watched Caleb command the crowd's attention, his presence solid as granite against the morning sky. I have an announcement, Caleb began, his voice carrying clear across the square. In 2 days' time, I'll be marrying Mrs. Eleanor Bishop. But before that happy event, there's something else needs saying. the crowd murmured. Leaning in, Harvey Lamont stood near the bank, his face mottled with rage. "Last night, someone tried to burn Mrs. Bishop out, threatened her safety to force a land sale." Caleb's eyes found Harvey's. "That ends now. As of this morning, I'm putting up the money to pay her tax debt. All of it. $300. Eleanor's breath caught. They hadn't discussed this. She started forward. "But Mrs. Patterson caught her arm, holding her back. "But that's not all." Caleb pulled out a leather wallet, heavy with bills. "I'll pay the tax debt of any small holder in this county who's being pressured to sell. The Millers, the Johnsons, Widow Garrett, anyone Harvey Lamont or any other speculator is trying to force out." The crowd exploded in voices. Several families pressed forward, tears streaming down faces that had been marked by desperation. "Furthermore," Caleb continued, raising his voice over the din, "I'm establishing a fund at the bank, the Territorial Bank in Cheyenne. Not here to provide low-interest loans to any family facing foreclosure. The railroad may come, gentlemen, but it won't come by stepping on the bones of decent folk." You can't do this," Harvey pushed through the crowd, his composure finally cracking. "You don't have the right." "I have every right to spend my money as I see fit." Caleb stepped down from the platform, moving toward Eleanor. The crowd parted before him. "And I choose to spend it protecting what matters." He stopped before Eleanor, who stood frozen between mortification and something that felt dangerously like hope. "You had no right," she whispered fiercely. "We agreed no saving each other, together or not at all." "We are together. Your fights are my fights now." He took her hands, mindful of the bandages. "But if it troubles you so much, consider it a loan. You can pay me back over the next 50 years or so." Caleb Rowe. "Every herd," he said quietly. His words meant only for her. "Every coin, all for your touch, Eleanor. All to see you free to choose your life instead of having it chosen for you." The crowd had gone silent, witnessing something raw and real between them. Eleanor felt tears threatening, the ones she'd held back for 2 years. "You impossible man," she breathed. "The whole town is watching." "Let them watch." He cupped her face gently. "Let them see that love isn't always pretty or convenient or proper. Sometimes it's messy and rushed and born from fire and desperation. But it's real, Eleanor. What I feel for you is the most real thing in my life." Behind them, Harvey made a sound like a wounded animal. "This isn't over. Rowe, you think you can buy your way into being some kind of hero? The railroad will come whether you like it or not." "The railroad's welcome to come," Caleb said without turning. "But it'll deal fair with folk, or it'll find its beef contracts elsewhere. I supply half the meat to the construction crews. Would be a shame if I had to find other buyers." The threat hung in the air. Harvey's face went from red to white as he calculated the implications. Without Caleb's cooperation, the railroad would face massive cost overruns. And Caleb had connections beyond Dust Valley, other ranchers who'd follow his lead. "You're making a mistake," Harvey spat. "Both of you. This town doesn't forget." "Neither do I," Eleanor said, finding her voice at last. She stepped forward, away from Caleb's protection, facing Harvey on her own. "I don't forget men who send thugs in the night, who prey on widows and orphans, who think money gives them the right to destroy lives." She looked around at the gathered townspeople, some sympathetic, some scandalized, all riveted. "Yes, I'm marrying Caleb Rowe. Yes, it's sudden. Yes, people will talk. But I'd rather be gossiped about as a living wife than pitied as a dead widow." "Mrs." Dully pushed through the crowd, her boarding house keys jangling. "Well, I think it's romantic. About time someone stood up to certain people in this town." She glared at Harvey. "And if anyone has nasty words to say about Mrs. Bishop, soon to be Mrs. Rowe, they can find somewhere else to buy their meals and rent their rooms." One by one, others began to speak up. Jake the barber, who'd been facing his own tax troubles. The Millers. whose farm Harvey had been circling. Even prim Mrs. Patterson, who declared that rushed weddings were sometimes necessary when true love couldn't wait. Eleanor felt something shift in the air. The town that had watched her struggle in isolation for 2 years was finally seeing her, acknowledging her fight. And more, they were choosing sides. Harvey backed toward his bank, his support evaporating. "This isn't over," he repeated, but the words lacked force. "Yes," Caleb said quietly. "It is." The banker fled, and the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excitement. Some approached Caleb about the loan fund. Others surrounded Eleanor, offering wedding help with varying degrees of sincerity. Through it all, Eleanor kept finding Caleb's eyes across the chaos. He'd done this, turned her private catastrophe into a public stand, made her struggle the town struggle. She should be furious at his high-handedness. Instead, she felt the first cracks in the dam she'd built around her heart. That evening, in the parsonage parlor with Reverend Mills and his wife as chaperones, Eleanor finally had a chance to speak privately with Caleb. $300, she said. "That's what that bull cost. You spent the money you'd saved for livestock on my tax debt." "The bull can wait. You couldn't." "And the others, the loan fund. How much did that promise cost you?" Caleb shrugged. "Less than watching good people driven from their homes would cost my conscience." Eleanor studied him, this complex man who'd hidden his generous heart behind walls of grief and distance. "When did you decide this morning?" "The moment I saw your shed burning. Maybe before." He leaned forward in his chair, elbows on knees. "I've been wealthy for years. Eleanor, built my fortune on other men's misfortune, buying cheap from desperate sellers, making hard bargains. I told myself it was business." "It was business." "No, it was fear. If I had enough money, enough land, enough cattle, I'd never be vulnerable again. Never lose what mattered." He laughed bitterly. "Except I'd already lost what mattered. Sarah was gone, and all the money in the world couldn't bring her back." Eleanor moved from her chair to sit beside him on the small settee. Propriety be damned. "So, what changed?" "You," he took her hand carefully. "Watching you fight with nothing but pride and needle and thread. You had every reason to give up, to take Harvey's money, to leave, but you stayed. You fought. You made me ashamed of my own cowardice." "You're many things. Caleb Rowe, but never a coward." "I was hiding in that big house, counting my coins while good people suffered." He brought her hand to his lips. "You woke me up. Eleanor, made me remember why I wanted to build something in the first place. Not for money or power, but to create something good, something that helps folks instead of grinding them down." Eleanor felt tears sliding down her cheeks, the tears she'd denied for so long. "I was so tired, Caleb, so tired of fighting alone." "You'll never fight alone again. That's my promise." He wiped her tears with his thumbs. "Partners. Remember equal partners in everything." Reverend Mills coughed discreetly from the doorway. "I hate to interrupt, but we need to discuss the ceremony details. 2 days isn't much time." They spent the next hour planning simple service. Just immediate friends. Eleanor would wear her good gray dress since there wasn't time for anything new. Through it all, the reality kept hitting her in waves. In 2 days, she'd be married again. To this man who'd upended his life and hers with a public declaration that still had the town buzzing. As Caleb prepared to leave, Eleanor walked him to the door. "The whole town will be watching our wedding now, after that scene this morning." "Good. Let them see that sometimes the right thing and the scandalous thing are one and the same." He kissed her forehead. "Sleep well, future Mrs. Row, dream of spring without fear." But Eleanor didn't sleep. She sat by her window in the boarding house, watching the lights of Longhorn Hill Ranch in the distance. Somewhere out there, Caleb was probably pacing his empty rooms, second-guessing his grand gesture. She smiled, thinking of his words in the square. Every herd, every coin, all for her touch. Not to own her or save her, but to free her. The difference mattered more than all the gold in Colorado. In 2 days, she'd walk down the aisle to meet him. The widow and the rancher, both carrying ghosts, both choosing to build something new from the ashes of what they'd lost. The town would watch and whisper and judge. But Eleanor found, to her surprise, that she no longer cared. Let them talk. She'd found something worth more than respectability or even security. She'd found a partner, a fighter, a man who'd stand in the public square and declare that her battles were his battles. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Harvey wouldn't give up easily. The town's memory was long, and forgiveness came slow. But tonight, Eleanor Bishop allowed herself to hope. In 2 days, she'd be Eleanor Rowe. The thought should terrify her. Instead, it felt like coming home. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, with a wind that swept down from the mountains carrying the promise of change. Eleanor stood in Mrs. Dully's best room, looking at herself in the mirror while Mrs. Patterson and young Mary Mills, the Reverend's daughter, fussed with her appearance. She wore her gray dress, the good one, carefully pressed, but Mary had insisted on adding touches of beauty. A piece of ivory lace at the throat, borrowed from Mrs. Dully. A cameo brooch that had been Mrs. Patterson's mother's. And in her hair, tiny white roses that Jake the barber's wife had somehow kept alive through winter in her kitchen window. "You need something blue," Mary declared, then pulled a ribbon from her own hair. "There, tied around your bouquet." The bouquet was simple evergreen branches and dried lavender, tied with the blue ribbon. Eleanor touched it gently, remembering another bouquet, another wedding. Thomas had picked wildflowers from the prairie, presenting them with a shy grin that made him look younger than his years. "You're thinking of him," Mrs. Patterson said quietly. "That's natural and right." Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. "He'd want you happy," the older woman continued. "Any man who loved you true would want that." A knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Dully peered in. "There's someone to see you, dear. Says it's important." Eleanor's heart sank. What now? Had Harvey made some last move, she followed Mrs. Dully to the parlor, steeling herself for trouble. Instead, she found Jake Hawley, Caleb's foreman, hat in hand and looking uncomfortable. Beside him stood a small woman with graying hair and kind eyes. "I'm Mrs. Bishop," Jake began. "This is Mrs. Sarah Rowe, Mr. Caleb's mother. She's come for the wedding." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Caleb's mother. He'd mentioned her only once, saying she lived in Denver with his sister, that she'd been too heartbroken after Sarah's death to visit the ranch. Mrs. Rowe. Eleanor's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Caleb didn't tell me you were coming." "He doesn't know." The older woman stepped forward, studying Eleanor with sharp eyes that reminded her painfully of Caleb's. "I came as soon as I had to see for myself the woman who finally woke my son from his long sleep." They stood facing each other, 2 women connected by one man's heart. Eleanor waited for accusations, for comparisons to the sainted Sarah, for disapproval of the hasty wedding. Instead, Mrs. Rowe reached out and took Eleanor's hands. "Thank you," she said simply, "for giving him a reason to live again." Eleanor's composure cracked. "Why didn't he save me more than—" "Hush!" Mrs. Rowe squeezed her hands. "I know my son, know how he's been these 5 years, rattling around that tomb he built. His letters were full of cattle prices and weather reports, but empty of life. Then suddenly, 3 weeks ago, they changed, full of Mrs. Bishop this and Eleanor that. First time he'd mentioned a woman's name since Sarah died." "I'm not her," Eleanor said, needing to be clear. "I can't replace—" "Good Lord, child. Who asked you to—" Mrs. Roe's eyes flashed. Sarah was a sweet girl, and she loved my son true. But she's gone, and the living can't compete with the perfect dead. You're not meant to be her. You're meant to be yourself, this woman who fought for her land and her dignity, and somehow reminded my son that he had a heart worth using. Eleanor felt tears threatening. Of all the reactions she'd expected from Caleb's family, acceptance hadn't been among them. Now, Mrs. Roe became brisk. Jake says the ceremony's in an hour. At the church. Yes, but won't Caleb be shocked? Should someone warn him? Let him be shocked. Boy needs more surprises in his life. She looked Eleanor up and down. You're wearing gray. It's my best dress. Mrs. Roe opened the carpet bag she'd brought. I thought as much. Not much time for shopping with a 2-day engagement. She pulled out a length of cream-colored silk. This was mine, from my own wedding. It's not a dress, but we can drape it like a shawl, if you'd like. Eleanor touched the silk with reverent fingers. It was beautiful, soft as water, embroidered with tiny flowers along the edges. I couldn't. You could and you will. I've been saving it for a daughter-in-law who never came. Sarah was going to wear it, but... She shook her head. The past is past. This is for the future. An hour later, Eleanor stood at the church door, the silk shawl around her shoulders like a blessing. The small church was fuller than expected. Word of Caleb's morning declaration had brought out supporters and curiosity seekers alike. She could see the Millers, the Johnsons, Widow Garrett, all the families Caleb had promised to help. They looked at her with something like hope. Jake Hawley offered his arm. Ready, ma'am. She'd asked him to give her away, having no male relatives and trusting Caleb's right-hand man to steady her nerves. He looked almost as nervous as she felt. Thank you, Jake, for everything. My pleasure, ma'am. Been waiting years to see the boss smile again. The organ wheezed to life, Mrs. Mills did her best, but the instrument was old and cantankerous. Eleanor stepped into the church, and every head turned. But she saw only Caleb. He stood at the altar in his best black suit, freshly shaven, his gray eyes wide with wonder. When he saw his mother in the front pew, his composure slipped for just a moment. Mrs. Roe gave him a little wave, and Eleanor saw him swallow hard. Then his eyes found Eleanor again, and everything else faded away. She walked toward him, aware of whispers and stares, but focused only on the man waiting for her. The man who'd chosen to stand with her against the world, who declared before the whole town that her battles were his battles. When she reached him, he leaned close. You're beautiful, he whispered. And is that my mother's shawl? She surprised me too, Eleanor whispered back. Reverend Mills cleared his throat. Dearly beloved, we gather today in somewhat unusual circumstances. A ripple of nervous laughter went through the congregation. Even the Reverend couldn't ignore the scandal of a 2-day courtship. But our Lord works in mysterious ways, he continued. Sometimes love comes slowly, built over years of patience, and sometimes it strikes like lightning, undeniable and transformative. What matters is not the timeline, but the truth of the connection. Eleanor felt Caleb's hand find hers, warm and steady. Calvin Josiah Roe, the Reverend intoned. Do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, in prosperity and adversity, for as long as you both shall live? I do. Caleb's voice rang clear and certain. Eleanor Marie Bishop, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, in prosperity and adversity, for as long as you both shall live? Eleanor looked into Caleb's eyes, seeing not just the man who'd saved her, but the partner who'd stand beside her. I do. The rings. Caleb produced 2 simple gold bands. Not the elaborate ring he'd given Sarah. Eleanor noted with relief. These were new, chosen for their new beginning. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Caleb spoke the traditional words, With this ring I thee wed. Then, softer, just for her, no more fighting alone. Eleanor, never again. She placed his ring with hands that barely trembled. With this ring I thee wed. And whispered back, partners in everything. By the power vested in me by God and the territory of Wyoming. Reverend Mills announced, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride, Mr. Rowe. Caleb cupped Eleanor's face gently, mindful of their audience. The kiss was soft, appropriate for public viewing, but Eleanor felt the promise in it of passion banked for privacy, of years to explore what they'd only begun. The church erupted in applause and a few rebel yells from the ranch hands. As they turned to face their community as husband and wife, Eleanor saw Harvey Lamont slip out the back door, his defeat complete. But she also saw the faces of their supporters, the families Caleb had saved, the women who understood second chances, the men who respected courage, even prim Mrs. Patterson was wiping away tears. Ready to face them, Mrs. Rowe, Caleb murmured. With you, I'm ready for anything. They walked down the aisle together, into a shower of rice and good wishes. Mrs. Rowe caught Eleanor in a fierce hug. Welcome to the family, daughter. Now let's see about getting you two a proper wedding breakfast. I didn't come all this way to see my son married without cake. The reception was held at Mrs. Dully's boarding house, spilling out onto the porch despite the cold. Someone brought a fiddle, someone else a harmonica. Before long, couples were dancing in the parlor, and the celebration had taken on a life of its own. Eleanor found herself swept from one well-wisher to another, accepting congratulations and sly comments about the haste with as much grace as she could muster. But her eyes kept finding Caleb across the room, and each time, he was already looking at her. Finally, as the sun began to sink toward the mountains, Caleb appeared at her elbow. Time to go. Mrs. Rowe, we have a long ride home. Home, not to her small house with its painful memories, but to the ranch, their ranch now. They made their farewells, Eleanor hugging Mrs. Rowe tightly. Thank you for the shawl, for coming, for raising such a good man. You just make him happy, the older woman whispered. That's all I ask. As they climbed into the wagon decorated with ribbons and more rebel yells from the ranch hands, Eleanor looked back at the town that had watched her struggle and judged her choices. Some faces were friendly now, some still skeptical, but she'd learned something important. Their opinions mattered less than the man beside her, the ring on her finger, and the future they'd build together. No regrets, Caleb asked as they drove away, the wedding guests still waving. Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him. Only that we didn't do this sooner. He laughed, the sound rich and full. 2 days from proposal to wedding, and she wishes it had been faster. I've married a wild woman. You've married a determined woman, Eleanor corrected. There's a difference. Not from where I'm sitting. He kissed the top of her head. And I wouldn't have it any other way. As they drove toward Longhorn Hill Ranch, toward their new life together, Eleanor Bishop Rowe allowed herself a moment of pure happiness. The wind whipped around them, cold and fierce, but she was warm in her husband's arms. Behind them, the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. Ahead, the ranch lights beckoned like stars. She'd lost everything and found it again. Transformed. The widow who wouldn't cry had become a bride who chose joy. And that, Eleanor thought as Caleb began to hum the melody he'd played on his harmonica that night by her fire, was the greatest victory of all. 5 years later. Eleanor stood at the kitchen window of the house they'd built together, watching her children play in the yard where her old home once stood. They'd torn down the small cabin that first spring, using the good wood to frame this new dwelling larger but not ostentatious, comfortable but not grand, a home built for living, not for show. Mama, watch, 4-year-old Sarah Rose called out, her dark hair flying as she spun in circles. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, a combination that promised interesting times ahead. "Careful, little bird," Eleanor called back, one hand resting on her rounded belly where the third-row child grew. 2-year-old Thomas Calvin, named for both their pasts, toddled after his sister, determined not to be left behind. He had Eleanor's coloring but Caleb's quiet intensity, often found studying bugs or leaves with solemn concentration. The sound of horses drew her attention to the road. Caleb was returning from town with Jake and several hands, their weekly supply run complete, but there was an extra wagon today, loaded with lumber. "What's all this?" Eleanor asked as Caleb swung down from his horse, coming to greet her with a kiss that still made her heart skip after 5 years. "Schoolhouse supplies," he said, grinning at her surprise. "Town council finally approved it. Dust Valley's getting a proper school, and they want to build it on that piece of land where your old shed stood." Eleanor's throat tightened. The land where Harvey Lamont had tried to burn her out would now hold a place of learning. "That's perfect." "Thought you'd like it. They want you on the school board. By the way, said they need someone who understands what it means to fight for a future." Before Eleanor could respond, young Sarah had attached herself to her father's leg. "Papa Tommy tried to eat a beetle." "Did not," Thomas protested, then added honestly, "only looked at it." Caleb scooped up both children with practiced ease. "Beetles aren't for eating, son, though I knew a man in the war who," he caught Eleanor's warning look, "who studied them very carefully, just like you." They moved inside together, the house filling with the comfortable chaos of family life. Eleanor set about preparing lunch while Caleb helped the children wash up, their chatter echoing through rooms that had once stood empty. This house held no ghosts. They'd built it together, choosing each board and nail, each window placement. The parlor had Eleanor's piano, a wedding gift from Caleb, and the library held books they'd selected together. Sarah's blue curtains had found a place in the children's nursery, repurposed with love rather than duty. "Letter came for you," Caleb said, producing an envelope from his coat. "From Denver." Eleanor recognized her mother-in-law's handwriting and opened it eagerly. Mrs. Rowe visited twice a year, had been present for both children's births, and wrote regularly between visits. "She's coming for Christmas," Eleanor announced, "and bringing your sister's family. The house'll be full to bursting," Caleb warned. "Good. Houses should be full." Eleanor moved to the stove, stirring the pot of stew. "Do you remember that first winter when you played harmonica in my kitchen, and we pretended we weren't falling in love?" "Weren't pretending. We're falling." Caleb came up behind her, arms circling her waist, hands gentle on her pregnant belly. "Still am?" "Mama's getting mushy," Sarah announced with 4-year-old disgust. "That's because Mama loves Papa," Eleanor said, turning in Caleb's arms, "just like Papa loves Mama." "And we love you," Caleb added, releasing Eleanor to chase giggling children around the kitchen table. After lunch, while the little ones napped, Eleanor and Caleb sat on the porch, looking out over land that bore no resemblance to the desperate holding she'd once fought to save. The garden thrived behind new fences. The rebuilt shed held proper tools. Cattle grazed in the distance. Part of the Longhorn Hill herd, but somehow also theirs. "Harvey left town last month," Caleb mentioned casually. "Heard he's trying his luck in California." "Good riddance." Eleanor felt only mild satisfaction. Harvey Lamont seemed like a bad dream now. A wolf who'd threatened when she was vulnerable, but who'd slunk away when she'd found her pack. "The railroad's coming through next year. They're routing it north of town, away from the small holdings." Caleb smiled. Funny how cooperative they got when the Cattlemen's Association expressed concerns. Eleanor laughed. Caleb had become a force in territorial politics, using his influence to protect the vulnerable rather than exploit them. The loan fund he'd established had saved 17 families so far, creating a network of gratitude and mutual support that Harvey's greed could never have built. "I was thinking," Caleb said slowly, "about that land across the creek, the old Baxter place that's been empty since they moved back east." "What about it?" "Might make a good home for Jake. He's been talking about proposing to Mary Mills, and a foreman should have his own place." Eleanor smiled. Jake and the Reverend's daughter had been courting for 2 years, a slow and proper romance that amused everyone who knew about Eleanor and Caleb's whirlwind wedding. "That's generous." "It's smart. Good people stay when they have roots." He took her hand, thumb rubbing over her wedding ring. "Besides, I remember what it's like to want to build something with the woman you love but not have the means." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint patterns through the cottonwoods. Inside, Eleanor could hear the children beginning to stir from their naps, Thomas calling for water in his serious little voice. "I'll get them," Caleb said, but Eleanor was already rising. "Together," she said, pulling him up. "We do everything together, remember." As they went inside to tend their children, Eleanor caught sight of herself in the hall mirror. The woman looking back bore little resemblance to the frozen widow who'd once stood tearless at a graveside. This woman had laugh lines and sun-touched skin, hair escaping from its pins, and hands marked by both work and gentleness. This woman was alive. That evening, as was their custom, the family gathered in the parlor after supper. Eleanor played piano while Caleb accompanied on harmonica, the children dancing or simply spinning until they fell down dizzy. These were the moments Eleanor treasured most, the ordinary magic of a Tuesday night, a family making music together. "Tell the story," Sarah demanded, climbing onto Caleb's lap. "About the cattle and the fence." It had become family legend, the night Caleb's cattle broke through Eleanor's fence and changed everything. Each telling grew more elaborate, with Sarah insisting on more details about the animals, Thomas wanting to know about the mechanics of fence repair. "It was the coldest night of the year," Caleb began, his storytelling voice rich and warm. "And your mama was the bravest woman in Wyoming, standing in the snow in her nightdress." "With a gun," Sarah added gleefully. "With an empty gun," Eleanor corrected, settling Thomas on her lap. "Because your mama had more pride than sense in those days." "What's pride?" Thomas asked. "It's when you're too stubborn to ask for help," Eleanor said, catching Caleb's eye over the children's heads. "Even when you need it." "But then Papa helped anyway," Sarah said, knowing the story by heart. "And fixed the fence and brought coffee and fell in love with Mama." Caleb finished, kissing the top of Sarah's head. "Though, truth be told, I think I was already halfway there." "What's halfway?" Thomas wanted to know. As Caleb patiently explained fractions to their 2-year-old, Eleanor felt a deep contentment wash over her. This life, these people were worth every moment of pain that had come before. She'd lost Thomas and mourned him truly, would always carry that grief. But she'd learned that hearts could expand, that love wasn't diminished by sharing but multiplied. Later, after the children were asleep and the house had settled into nighttime quiet, Eleanor and Caleb stood together in their bedroom, the one they'd designed with windows facing east to catch the morning light. "No regrets?" Caleb asked, echoing his question from their wedding day. Eleanor pulled him close, feeling the familiar solidness of him, the safety and excitement that never grew old. "Only one." His eyebrows rose in concern. "I regret every day we didn't have together. Every moment you were in that big house and I was in my small one. Both of us too proud and scared to reach out. We found each other when we were meant to," Caleb said softly. "When we were ready to build something new instead of just hiding in what we'd lost." Eleanor thought of all the small moments that had led them here, broken fences and borrowed coats, harmonica music and shared dinners, a fire that had meant to destroy, but had instead forged something unbreakable. "I love you, Caleb Rowe," she said, meaning it with every fiber of her being. Thank you for seeing me when I'd forgotten how to see myself. I love you, Eleanor Rowe, he replied, for reminding me that life was worth living, not just enduring. Outside, the Wyoming wind sang its ancient song across the prairie. But inside their home, their true home, all was warmth and peace. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys. The new baby would arrive come spring. The school would be built. Their children would grow. Life would continue its dance of sorrow and celebration. But tonight, Eleanor Bishop Rowe stood in the arms of the man who'd offered everything he had ever heard, every coin just for the chance to love her. And she knew, with bone-deep certainty, that she'd found her place at last, not just in his arms or in this house, but in the life they'd built from ashes and hope. The widow who wouldn't cry had learned to laugh again. The rancher who'd built a tomb had created a home, and together, they'd written a love story that would be told around Dust Valley firesides for generations of how sometimes the best things come from the worst circumstances, and how two broken people can build something whole and beautiful if they're brave enough to try. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate across the darkness, but here in the house that love built, all was light and life and the promise of tomorrow. And that, Eleanor thought as she drew her husband down for a kiss that tasted of forever, was everything. Thank you all for listening to this story of love, loss, and redemption in the Old West. I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss Eleanor and Caleb's journey together. If you enjoyed this tale, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850, give this video a like, and hit that hype button to help more people discover these stories of the American frontier. Your support means everything and helps keep these tales alive for others to enjoy.